Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today, our guest is Julia Sadusky, and she's going to be talking to us about gender identity and faith. And so we're going to start this conversation with her in a moment. And there's some resources on our show notes about some books that she's written, where to find her, who she is, background, all that good stuff. And then as well as our other normal links and things that we have on all our show notes, like finding a local confessional Reformed church near you, like just a link to type in your zip code and find that for a resource for you guys. Also, just how to contact us if you have any questions. Or want to get a hold of us, our email is guiltgracepod@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram, as well as these conversations uploaded to YouTube. So that's a good way to find us. And then just information about our Bridge Builder sponsors like Logos Bible Software and more. So we're going to just jump right here into this conversation. I'll let Peter further introduce Julia Sadusky.
Yeah, we have Dr. Julia Sadusky is a licensed clinical psychologist and owner of Lux Counseling and Consulting, a private practice in Littleton, Colorado. She's a fellow of the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute at Wheaton College with Dr. Mark Yarhouse as well, and an advisor for the Center of Faith, for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and an adjunct professor at Denver Seminary. She's a co-author with Mark Yarhouse of Emerging Gender Identities, which is through Brazos Press, I believe, understanding the diverse experiences of today's youth, and today's kind of book that we're kind of focusing on, but a lot of her work as well with IVP Academic, Gender, Faith, and Identity. But it's a pleasure having you on the show to talk about this complex but also needed topic. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you both.
For sure. So those who may not know you and know your work and whatnot, maybe let our listeners know a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit about me. I grew up on the East Coast, so from Delaware originally. Went to college in South Florida, went to a small Catholic liberal arts college. And then I moved up to Virginia to go to grad school. Did a little bit of work in substance abuse before that, and then went to Regent University to study under Mark Yarhouse. So I came across his work in undergrad, and really what got me into this field was I had people in my life who were sharing with me that they were attracted to the same sex, gay, lesbian, bisexual. And I was really struck by how little I had to say that I felt I could say with some level of clarity and courage and conviction. And so I kind of in college went on my own journey of wrestling with Christian theology, and then ultimately, came to really appreciate a traditional sexual ethic, and also was accompanying people in my life who were exploring sexual identity. So Mark's work was really fascinating to me. But I think if you had asked me at the time if I would move into the area of gender, I wouldn't have ever expected that. And it was really at Regent, right when Mark's book, Understanding Gender Dysphoria, came out, that I was working on his research team. We were reading that book. And I happened to be supervised by him in the clinic there. And so my first clinical year, the people coming to see me wanted to be seen by the person being supervised by him. And so that brought in a lot of people who were wrestling with gender identity questions, experiencing gender dysphoria. And so I think at that point, it became clear to me that that was going to be an area that I could step into more, that I had a lot of working knowledge on. And I was also doing youth ministry at the time on the side, just helping out with a youth group in the area. And that was really where I started speaking more on gender and sexuality, and then writing more with Mark. And that's really how I got into this work. And now I'm in private practice and doing a lot of different things. I got a specialty in eating disorders and complex trauma. So that's a little bit of my caseload right now. And I have a new book series coming out through Ave Maria Press that's going to be more generally, how do we talk with kids and teens about their bodies, sexuality, in developmentally appropriate ways. So that's kind of maybe a little bit different from what we're here to talk about, but that's a little bit about me.
Okay. Yeah, and so maybe to set some groundwork, so you've already kind of answered a part of my other question, because you've written, like you said, you co-written a couple books with Dr. Yarhouse on some of these topics, and you have a practice devoted to this and other things. But maybe how would you describe? So we've already talked about gender identity and faith, but one of the big topics that you talk about is gender dysphoria, which is talked about a little bit today, but you don't really hear it in church circles as much. But maybe describe what gender dysphoria is, and kind of, is that different than kind of like a gender identity or sexuality? Like, is there a difference, and how would you describe it?
Yeah, great question. So I would say the easiest way to think about it is for most of us, our gender identity, meaning our psychological experience of self as a gendered person, as a person with a body, as a person, distinguished between male and female, our gender is usually aligned with our biological sex, that those are compatible, maybe is another way to think about it. There are people, though, for whom the gender is distressing, meaning there's an incongruence or a gap between their biological sex and their experience of self psychologically. The gap between is pretty distressing. So think about the fact that we take our bodies everywhere we go. We can't leave it at home. And if my body feels alien or different or off to me, that can be pretty challenging, especially when I take it everywhere, especially when our sexed bodies remind us of our biological sex regularly, if you're a woman or a man, that you're bumping up against both your internal experience of self and then the social perception of you, that both of those things can be incredibly challenging for people with gender dysphoria.
Before next question, maybe to juxtapose this, how, especially since we're talking about the church and Christians in general, how have we maybe, or the church or individuals concerned with this stuff, have they maybe misunderstood some of these things?
Yeah, I think we'd like to be able to name something that feels kind of clean and simple, like a delusion or disordered or weird or crazy. And so I hear a lot of those words float around that maybe people have never met somebody with gender dysphoria. Maybe they've heard about these conversations on news or media or political forums. And none of those help us appreciate what that experience would be like for somebody. And I think that leads us to really distance the other and say, oh, you're just delusional. You're just crazy. You're just traumatized. And I would say that even in the case that that was true, I'm not sure that that's a charitable way to talk about people.
Just to keep them at arm's length.
Yeah, and also as Christians, right, we really believe and hammer in that people are made in the image and likeness of the invisible God. And I don't know that that is a very honoring way to communicate that doctrine to people. And so I think we mischaracterize, we assume a lot, and that makes it really, really difficult to approach this conversation calmly, curiously, and thoughtfully.
Yeah, almost like, hey, if you struggle with this stuff, you're like kind of in the image, but not as much as I am.
That's exactly right. And that's a real source of, I think, pride we could understand in our circles. Okay. And we have a harder time correcting one another, and we like to go outside and correct the other, I think, more comfortably.
Okay, cool.
So as our listeners know, if they've listened to us at any length of time, or if you're brand new to this show, it's pretty clear that we're confessionally Reformed Presbyterians. Obviously, we're pretty ecumenical on our show of bringing other denominations and people on, but that's who Peter and I are. We're confessionally Reformed Presbyterians who understand the Bible is really clear, as well as other Christians. Obviously, we're not saying we're the only ones that understand the Bible is clear, but we really appreciate how the Bible is clear on sexuality and gender. And however, we do recognize how incredibly complex these issues are in this, post-fall world as well, and how ill-equipped both, some pastors could be, and obviously many lay leaders and fellow church members are in the church to work with individuals who struggle with these things. And you kind of alluded to that a little bit, Julia. How do you begin counseling and working with these factors in place, kind of on a practical level right out of the gate, knowing our biblical convictions, and they could be Christian too. They could, they have biblical convictions too. So they're struggling with this even more. What's kind of your advice there?
Yeah. So I would say that when I meet with somebody, it is really essential, and you see this in the book, to
Hmm.
really understand where somebody's coming from. And that's very hands off, right? Just kind of asking open-ended questions, trying to get a good framework for what has been the arc of a person's spiritual journey and how has that interacted or not with their gender related distress. That's true for families too. So I work with a lot of parents and loved ones of a person exploring gender, identifying as transgender or non binary. And so I work with the families and do the same thing. Like, tell me more about how your church talked about this growing up. What's your current understanding? What are the things that you received from your faith community that have been a gift to you? What are some of the things that have felt really difficult to integrate in your faith, in your walk with God, in your social life? I mean, how do these things intersect and how do they get siloed from one another? So I would say that assessment piece is pretty important. And then I would say the other big thing to start with is acknowledging how much the polarization makes it difficult to have these conversations with anybody, even a therapist. I think for many Christians, I represent both the Christian world, but also the field of psychology. And that field has often been seen and experienced as hostile to Christian beliefs and values. So what I try to do is let somebody know from right out the gate that I'm not here to change your convictions. I'm not here to convince you or get you to a point that I want you to be, or that the secular field of psychology thinks you should be, or maybe your first pastor you talked to about this thought you needed to be. I mean, really, what I try to do is remove some of those constraints, help people talk about their values in complex ways, point them in the direction of people, leaders in their faith community who could be a resource to them, other people who have written, spoken on this topic, and really ensure my commitment, which is to walk with them where they actually go, accompany them and their families. And that usually brings down defensiveness, where people don't feel like they have to prove to me where they are, but that we can have a more open, curious conversation that's going to be more sustainable long term.
Yeah, and again, I think for especially this is helpful to juxtapose a few things before my next question. So, when let's say a church wants to counsel, or a pastor wants to counsel somebody who struggles with some of these things, what's maybe if you've 'cause I'm sure you've heard and seen some really horrible ways of doing this. So maybe and not to say look, we're just going to kind of dwell on this, but what's maybe the wrong way to start approaching counseling, or how has the church maybe been doing it not wrong, but kind of put the cart before the horse and say, hey, let's talk about this first. What's maybe some ways you've seen this done not incorrectly, but just unhelpfully?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it helps listeners not reinvent the wheel. Is there's things we can all
Yeah.
agree are just not working for people. And I would say one of those things is fixating with a person on rigid stereotypes. Like, gosh, if you just went and got your nails done as a woman, like let's get you with the women's ministry and move you into some of those stereotypically feminine options for you in the hopes that
Mm-hmm.
that will be curative of your distress, without asking any follow-up questions, right, about a person's journey, what they've tried, what they've not tried, just really making assumptions of what's going to be curative for somebody. That would be
Okay.
one common mistake.
Like quick fixes.
Quick fixes. Yeah. I think theories of causation get thrown around. I think people in ministry, I know when I've been in ministry, I like to have answers or understanding to offer
Yeah.
people. And I don't
Yeah.
know that that's particularly bad, but it can certainly come out in unhelpful ways here, where it's like, oh, so tell me about when you were abused, or I've heard a lot of people have been abused, so that's probably your story. What was that
Mm.
about? Or what other traumas have you had? Right? I mean, there can be a lot of assumptions about people that get made that foreclose on conversation. If I'm the person with gender dysphoria sitting in your office as a pastor and you say that to me, I want to get out of that room as quickly as possible, as
Mm.
opposed to if I go in and talk with you and you are calm and your
Mhm.
tone is not like you're, getting on a, a political podcast to argue about, the bathroom bills, but you're just kind of calm and
Yeah.
curious. And I think a good question there that really works is just, gosh, I'm catching up with you. I'm just getting to hear a little snapshot. Tell me a little bit more about your journey. I want to hear about what this was like when you were a kid, what this was like when you were a teen, what this was like as you got older, what's it been like to sit in our church if you've been in our congregation for some time. Those open-ended questions are going to serve you a lot better than simply moving to these kinds of caricatures.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll dig into some of these stuff too later on in some of these questions. In your work too, you point to many issues, and I've looked through some of the stuff that you've done too, that you want to approach with someone who struggles with gender identity, depression, anxiety, and whatnot. And I think so often, like you said, the church looks at the branches, so the stuff that's visible to somebody else, like, oh, this is what they deal with, obvious to us, to our eyes, so I guess supposedly obvious to us, to our eyes, rather than diving deeper into some issues. And you talk about this too, of their psychological health. So someone who's so desperately, because a lot of them, they're like, I just want to talk about my gender. I just want to talk about like this confusion that I have. I don't want to talk about deeper issues. But you talk about, no, it's in some senses necessary to talk about some deeper issues. So how do these like interplay with each other? Stuff that's really kind of going on below, but like the stuff that actually show forth to you or somebody else.
Yeah. Well, so it's a tricky thing because for some people, their depression or their anxiety interacts with their gender distress. I wish it was as clean always as like there's this over here and this is separate. And so, if a person feels very isolated, alienated, has a lot of self-hatred, they're probably going to experience a great level of depression and anxiety in their faith community. And so many people would attribute that to their gender-related distress. And there's times where that really is the case. And then there's times where they're almost parallel tracks. You've got the depression over here. You've got the gender-related distress over here. They interact with one another. And yet they're not, one is not causing the other, right? So that's always a caveat with people, that it's not to say that once we treat your depression, we treat your anxiety, your gender distress is going to go away. I can't guarantee that for anybody. But I would say that when I am able to walk with somebody and address depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, whatever is there for that person, and most of us have multiple things going on. So I don't know that,
just to say those who deal with this stuff have depression, but everybody does. But sometimes it could be laying below the surface.
Yeah, layered there. But I would say that the intensity of a person's distress can be managed differently when those factors and variables are better managed. And so certainly there's some people who come in and they really do. They say, I want to talk about the gender stuff. And it's not as if I say, you can't talk about that yet. But I'm teaching them that, gosh, if you're having panic attacks and you're not able to go to work, I don't know that I'm going to serve you very well if we start digging into something maybe equally or more painful, talking about your gender distress when it's hard to go to work. Like, I want you to be able to keep a job right now, or if you end your life, if you're self-harming, it's going to be really a moot point to talk about gender. And so let's make sure that you're safe before we dig in deeper, because in my experience, the gender pieces are equally or sometimes more painful to talk about. And so I don't want to do that prematurely if we don't have skills in place, other things to help a person support to do that piece of work.
Yeah, before Nick's next question, and this is more curiosity, and you kind of talk about it in some of the stuff that I've read, but just pure curiosity from me. I guess I kind of assume somebody who has faith conviction, somebody who struggles with what the Bible says about gender and identity, who comes to your office or comes to you for counseling help, this is just my pure question, might have a little bit more stress and anxiety than somebody who doesn't have some of these convictions. Is that, or like maybe comes from a more conservative family and has specific expectations about what they're supposed to do or not to do? Does that kind of play a role too, and kind of where they come from and what their expectations are for this stuff, and kind of maybe adds more anxiety to the plate than somebody who may not have it?
So I think there's some truth to that. I mean, certainly, if your values have been pretty rigid or black and white about this conversation, like transgender people are an abomination, that's something that
Hmm.
some churches preach from the pulpit. If you grew up hearing that, you're going to have a really different experience of gender distress than a person who didn't. So I think many people assume that, and that's a fair assumption. I would also say that there are times where people's faith can be a resource or a protective factor for them, right? That I don't know where I'd be without my faith community. My small group has really rallied around me, and that's the place of the church that I think is really exciting, that we can actually buffer against the intensity of mental health concerns when we show up well for one another. We can be safe places and secure bases for people.
Hmm.
Um, how often is that happening effectively? Not as often as I'd like. So that's
Yeah.
to your point, I think, where you do tend to see some of the distress maybe heightened, or the stakes feel higher, right? Because if it's a salvation question for me, or if it's going to opt me in or out of my community, the stakes feel much higher than for somebody else.
Mm.
But I would also say many people with gender dysphoria in general are struggling much more with mental health concerns than the general population. And so I would say this group in general is a group that needs our support and resourcing, people of faith or not.
Mm. Okay.
So this is particularly helpful because you are a Christian and you're also a psychologist, like you said. So it's kind of another question I have is practical bridging that gap. You know, you're coming from, you understand the Christian faith where, you know, our Christian faith says we can't turn anyone away from the church. That's pretty clear. We're not supposed to turn people away.
Yeah,
Hmm.
And definitely we can't keep the gospel from people.
that's right.
So there's probably some issues certain churches face when their response to those who deal with gender identity issues and dysphoria. And instead of listening and loving them like you're talking about as they struggle and welcoming them in and taking care of them and nurturing them, there might be some that out of the gate could beat them down with just stop sinning, or just act like your gender and be more this, be more that. And maybe even their intentions might be good, where they're saying certain scripture where it's like Genesis 1 through 3, Genesis 5, Romans 1, other texts, and just right out of the gate, just word vomiting that stuff. And what's more helpful and loving approach without taking away our convictions as Christians as well?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a big source of fear and anxiety. And I think well-meaning Christians listening to this podcast are going to
Hmm.
be able to relate to some of what you shared. Like,
Oh
oh,
yeah.
I've done that.
Yeah.
I've said
Yep.
that. And
I've actually myself personally done that,
that's
which
right.
is
That's
now
right.
feels terrible.
Well, and so just kind of making space for the fact that we're really learning, and as people of faith, God didn't say once we become Christians, we stop being sinful ourselves and we don't
Hmm.
hurt people anymore. And so I think um, what has been really helpful as a starting point, if you're in the situation where you look back on how you've responded in the past and it has been harmful to your child, your cousin, your niece, your nephew, your loved one, person at your church, the most helpful thing to start with is to apologize. Um, to say, hey, I wanted to go back 5 years ago, 3 months ago, 2 weeks ago at the dinner table. I made this comment, and that was not how Christ relates to people. Like, that's not what I'm called to do as a Christian. And I wanted to apologize. And when we apologize, we can't actually demand that people accept our apology, you know? So somebody may not be ready to rebuild that trust in this moment, but I would say that's the most helpful thing right out the gate. Um, is when we've made mistakes, let's circle back, assume we've messed up. Some ways we know about, some ways we aren't familiar with. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that hurt you in that way. I didn't mean that at all. Well, being able to make space for those conversations. And then I mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but breaking a person's life up and saying, hey, I'm just catching up with you. And Mark Carehouse often shares this, that, in talking with a pastor who said, what do I say? It's, well, I'm catching up with you. Let's say you're 40 at maybe chapter 6 or 7 of your
Mm-hmm.
story. And I want to hear about chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you were raised in a Christian church, what were the things that helped you? What didn't? What really pushed you away? And then the final, maybe practical piece at this point that I would say is actually helping people get plugged into a community of believers without kind of clickbait or kind of
Uh-huh.
bait and switch approach, where it's like,
Yeah.
well, we need to figure out where you land on all of this theologically right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't have those right answers, you can't come in the door. I mean, we just don't do that with heterosexual cisgender Christians. We just
Mm-hmm.
don't tend to do that as much. Sit down and grill every person.
Yeah. Tell me what you think about alcoholism and divorce and all that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. So the pastoral approach for me is the same approach that we try to take with anybody else, which is once we kind of hear somebody's stories, hear the nuances of that, we get to focus on their overall formation. How are we helping this person grow in virtue? Um, and what are the barriers to that? Are there things that have gotten in the way and continue to get in the way? Ways that we might turn somebody away? And then finally, what do we do when other people in the church get mad about our pastoral care to this or that person? Because
Hmm.
unfortunately, there will be times where people misunderstand. And
Hmm.
I think as pastors, we're going to then be invited to, well, actually, yeah, advocate for the one and say, here's why
Hmm.
we've invited this person into our Bible studies, into our community, is we actually don't believe that we're allowed by Christ to turn people away.
Mm-hmm.
There's important pastoral questions about membership and leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and those are probably outside of the scope of our time, but certainly I walk with churches around those questions as well. And if you have a foundation of relationship, those conversations are going to go way better no matter where you fall on membership and leadership, those types of things.
Hmm. Yeah. So it kind of sounds like what a lot of churches want to do is they want to, the first thing somebody hears when they walk in, somebody who deals with these issues, who's struggling, because it's not like they're kind of set in stone and like, yeah, I'm really happy about what I'm going through right now. They're distressed because they're like, I don't, like we talk about, like, I don't want to go through these things. This is not like my decision to want to have to deal with some of these things. And the church will start with their convictions, which like we have our convictions to be sure, but we'll start with our convictions. And then once we pass that barrier, then we'll talk to them, versus talking to them with our convictions, not held to the chest, but we want to get to know them first. And then we introduce them like, hey, this is what we believe about this stuff. Where it seems like what you're saying is a lot of churches will flip this order. Well, they'll say, hey, this is what we believe. If you don't believe this, you can't be with us.
That's right. And I would add there that, it has a different quality when I'm talking with an adult if they ask me, what are your convictions?
Mm.
Versus if I start to just
You just tell
lecture
them.
them
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so usually, what I'd recommend is being able to ask the person, would it be helpful to know about the convictions of our church where we land today? Because I wouldn't want a church to keep it so close to the chest that you're kind of
For sure.
leading somebody as if you think one thing and then
Yeah, they don't hear it to the very end. It's like, oh, this
yeah,
is what you believe. Oh, never
that's
mind.
right. It can feel like whiplash. And so you don't want to be deceitful. And you don't want to have to apologize for your convictions. I wouldn't do that. You want to be clear, but that's going to land differently if you treat somebody with the dignity to assume they have also wrestled with this
Mm.
for quite some time in most cases. And I would rather give them the benefit of the doubt there and assume they've really done their work than come in as if I'm the expert on all of it. And here, let me tell you what God says about all of this. Has a really
Mm.
different quality than, would you like to hear where we've landed today as a church about this conversation, our best understanding theologically? And here's the gestures we can still offer you as a believer out of that posture that we have.
Yeah, that's really helpful. and another big emphasis in your work, and I think we assume that we have kind of the what we think is what everybody else thinks, and our culture is the same as everybody else's. But a lot of the cultural assumptions that both pastors, parents, churches, we both knowingly and unknowingly impose upon people who struggle with their gender identity and dysphoria. So what kind of questions and help can you bring to some of these kind of cultural presuppositions and better frame some of these to discuss our cultural assumptions? We'll say hey, just like you said, paint your nails and go get a dress and you'll feel more like a lady, or go to the go destroy something and feel like a man, or whatever it may be. How can we better not just bring these, but not even question them, but know that we have these assumptions coming to these conversations?
Yeah, I think the presuppositions end up playing out really practically in faith communities in the formatting of men's retreats or women's retreats, or women's nights, men's nights, and
men's Bible studies on the Book of Genesis, women's Bible studies on the Book of Ruth, or whatever it is.
That's right. All of that is going to filter down. And if I'm a pastor, I want to know how the people in my church are experiencing that, who are wrestling in this space. Because if we're saying that, whether you like to paint your nails doesn't decide if you're a man or a woman, or whether you like to wear dresses even doesn't decide if you're really a man or a woman. Yeah, because
Americans would be shocked what other people do outside of America, where the things we assume are feminine are not assumed feminine elsewhere, and the things assumed masculine are not masculine elsewhere.
That's right. So I would just say that if we're going to really push back on the narrative that there's these rigid norms that if you fit into that decides your gender identity, then we have to kind of call ourselves on the ways that we've also influenced the conversation by having sometimes pretty rigid norms of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And so I tend to just open that up for people, I think, and just say, I hear you saying to me, that you wish your biological female daughter would dress in a certain way. I also hear your child telling me that they don't think they're a girl because they don't like to dress that way. And then I hear you as a parent say to me that that's not what makes her a girl. But then we loop back to, but you really wish she would do these, conforming to the norms, standards. And so just really putting a magnifying glass over that and saying, are we sure that's what we want to communicate to her, right? Are we that sure that this is what it means to be a child of God, a man or woman of God, that we're going to push that? So that's kind of how I do that one-on-one is just really, here's what I'm hearing you say. And I do it with churches too. It's so when your guys' night is wings and pizza, which wings and pizza are great. Football,
wings and pizza.
That's
exactly.
awesome.
Yeah.
But what's the connotation you're sending if it's wings, pizza, and football? And all the guys in the church, that's what they're supposed to like. And I'm not even saying don't have guys' nights and girls' nights. I'm not even saying, don't have some stereotypical options there for people, because a lot of people like wings. I love wings and football. So if that was your guys' night, I'd want to come to that. That'd be very fun.
Exactly.
But I think being able to really reflect on that and bring in people who have a range of interests, preferences into the planning of these types of things to really be thoughtful and make space for more people. So that's kind of because why? It's not just because it's an inaccurate reflection of the Christian life of virtue. It's also the exact kind of thing that evokes a person's gender-related distress. So if I know that that's going to be evoking and putting a kind of spotlight on a person's distress, I'm going to try to dim that lighting however I can. And if I know that we can't avoid it and there's going to be these things that play out that are difficult for somebody, then you better believe I'm checking in after that event. How was that for you? How you doing? I see you. I want to talk with you more. That's accompaniment in my mind. And it takes more work than cultural assumptions. And it's so worth it to get to do relationships with people in that more robust way.
Yeah, it seems like when you potentially have more rigid stereotypes, there can be a lot more bucking against the stereotypes, and people start questioning, like, well, I don't really fit into this stereotype, so I'm not really sure where I fit along the spectrum. And there might, like, and not saying that that's the only thing, but that could be adding on top of a lot of these issues. We're like, oh man, I don't fit into a stereotypical male mold, or I don't fit into a stereotypical female mold. And then the church doesn't really recognize that. Well, okay, well, why don't you just kind of fall in with what we're doing?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay.
One thing I found really interesting in your book is the open chair technique. I've actually heard of that before reading the book as well, from a pastor, actually. And it was more in a Christian application. Somebody, I'll let you describe what it is, obviously, but when somebody trying to get somebody to open up and be honest with God in prayer, just kind of pretending they're talking to Jesus face to face, but without taking away your thunder and letting you describe what it is, when working with your clients, how does the open chair technique help?
Yeah, great question. So, what is the open chair technique? So it's it comes out of a particular form of therapy, but really what it does is it helps a person externalize maybe a part of them or another person that they can't maybe access at this point. So sometimes you do this technique with a person who has a loved one who's died, and they haven't been able to share the things they wanted to say to that person because they died suddenly, or to God because, you know, they feel hesitant to talk to God, to approach him in prayer, but maybe there's space to, with another person present, to do that piece of work, write a letter, read it, that kind of thing. And what we've found with Mark and I, with people who are wrestling with, this is true for a lot of things, depression, anxiety, and certainly people exploring sexual identity, gender identity, or people who identify as LGBT, is many of them are taught in our communities to silo that part of them. Like, I can't look at that. And I certainly can't look at that in the company of another Christian. I've got to put that, metaphorically, we think of the closet, we could say there. I just got to keep it at arm's length. I cannot approach God in prayer with this part of me. So maybe I take that sideways and I find other ways to channel that, but I can't do that in an open relationship with another person. And so this technique, right, the therapist is sitting right there to support. And if it's too intense, it's you're asking questions of the gender dysphoria, for instance, or your gender identity questions. The therapist can kind of be there to help with that. So it's not too derailing, because for a lot of people, they don't tend to approach this part of them very often. And so to ask a question,
they're probably told not to as well.
Yeah, told not to, and feel like if I ask it questions, if I get curious about it, if I listen to what it wants for me, it's going to push me down a path that has a life of its own, that takes control in a way that pulls me away from the things that are important to me. But so you might ask a question like, so the gender related distress, what's it trying to tell you, right? What does it want you to know about it? What are some of the concerns it has? What are some of the hopes it has for you? Just a really different way of thinking about something that for some people is merely a struggle. And then they start to say, wow, you want me to be seen, accepted, known. You want me to feel at home in my body, and you recognize that's not where I am. And so you're trying to fight for me with that to find greater comfort. And just to build that level of compassion, understanding, and I think integration of this, as this is a part of my story that I can talk about with a greater freedom when I want to, is some of what's helpful about that technique. Don't use it with everybody, but there are people who really take to it.
Yeah, that's actually a really good kind of teeing off into this next question, because another part of your work is how we speak to God, again, kind of akin to this open chair technique, especially when the church, it could seem like we don't actually ever, like, we don't cry out to God all too often. We maybe thank God, which is great. We do parts of it. We have kind of happy, clappy praise songs all the time. And a lot of people who deal with this, I was like, man, I don't feel all that happy, clappy all that time. And is there like any language I can use to cry out to God? It's like, oh, that's like a third of the Psalms are lamenting about my enemies and what's going on within me and all these things. So like, I think the church models how to speak to God, rightfully so. But we forget that so much of the Bible contains laments. And so how can lamenting, how can some of this language around the Psalms and how the Bible like cries out to God, David will cry out to God, but you don't often hear that in the church, where it's like, it's kind of scary. It's like, oh, I don't know if I could do that to God. It's maybe, how does this maybe help somebody, or how have you seen this in your own practice, or have you used this in your own practice to help those dealing with these issues?
Yeah. Well, I think people are a lot more comfortable crying to God than screaming at God. That's been my
Ah,
experience. And so when somebody's really mad and they're saying, why did God make me this way? I remember one young person with gender dysphoria, I think was 9 years old, and literally was just
yeesh.
screaming in my office, like, what is wrong with him? I hate
Yeah,
him. I want God to die. I mean, just so angry, right?
yeah,
And I said, have you ever told him that? Just bug-eyed, right? Like, what do you mean? Could never. And right, as if he's not here
yeah. Am I
listening,
allowed
right?
to? Yeah,
And it's like, well, if he's real and if he's all powerful and all present, then he's here right now, and he can hear you. And my understanding of God is that he wants to. He
hmm,
wants to receive where you actually are, even
yeah. Of
when the
course.
anger's at him. And he's not going to answer right now, which is kind of nice actually, because sometimes when we're mad, we just want to be mad and share that
Yeah.
with somebody. And it's not just the anger that's there. That's the other thing, is once you start lamenting, and you see this in the Psalms, is they move and ebb and flow between praise and anger and sadness and fear and conviction that I trust you and still you are God, right? That as you start to move through it, people start to realize that it's not just anger. There's also heartbreak. There's also confusion. There's fear. There's sadness. There's grief. There's loss. There's joy. I mean, there's all of that as we go. And I think that's pretty instructive as to why God has given us these emotions in the first place. Is they're actually what allow us to approach Him in a real relationship that's free. And so that's some of how I use that. Sometimes people do it more, formally. They want to write an actual psalm of lament, and um, they read that, they share that. Some people I know do it very regularly. It's a regular journaling practice. Is how do I write out laments of where I'm at today, and what is the faithfulness I've seen of God in the midst of that. Kind of exercise of gratitude as well. So there's a lot of ways that can go, but it opens up a conversation that I think has been foreclosed on for too long. And especially for people who have been told you've got to figure out your convictions on this all before you can really have a good conversation with God. It's like, but I don't have that all figured out. So how can I approach him in prayer? And some of what I do is that permission giving. And I think the power of that coming from a pastor would even be a greater power than what I could offer, because people of faith want to look to their spiritual leaders to know what's okay.
Hmm,
And it's not just okay, but it's necessary to have a
hmm.
life of intimacy with the Lord.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful, because that's something that I've seen more and more, where you will take on the language of the church, or you
Mm-hmm.
will agree with the language of the church, and so the church is always, which again, rightfully so, is just praising. Which again, we're called to praise God, and I'm sure in your practice you talk about some of these things too. But if we don't hear the range of emotions coming from the church, or coming from our pastor, or coming from a leader, we can think that all I do is praise. But like, man, it's like I'm looking inside me, and I don't really have that much to praise, because I'm confused, I'm I'm depressed. Like I don't. Is like, am I allowed to feel these things if I never hear it from those leaders I have around me? Which then sounds like some of the stuff that when they come into your office, they're like, man, this is, I don't know if I don't know if I can feel this, because I don't ever hear this.
Right. Right. And that's where, right, the costs are quite great, because if I can't talk to him and I can't
Yeah.
talk to his people and I don't sound like them and I don't act like them and I don't look like them, then where do I belong? And the answer is
Yeah.
not here, right? And that's where a
Yep.
lot of
Even if they
people
don't
are.
say it, sometimes they will say it, but even though they don't say it, that comes That comes pretty loud and clear.
Exactly. And that's why I think most people I work with who are teens have really walked away from Christian faith. They maybe have been raised in a Christian denomination, but for them, it doesn't feel like it's an option to walk
Mm,
that out. And I would love for us to send a different message. And I think we're capable of doing that no matter where we lie theologically.
for sure.
Before my last question, there's a quote that I really enjoy, that I heard years and years ago that relates to this and so much more. The Lord God doesn't call the qualified; He qualifies the called. So that kind of ties into this question that our convictions are that someone doesn't need to just clean themselves up or get it together and then approach God. God isn't waiting for us to look completely clean before we can approach him and have a relationship with him.
Yeah.
Jesus wants us where we are right now to start a relationship with him and not a second longer. So that's where that quote I was thinking of. The Lord God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. So too often it can sound like the gospel for those who deal with gender identity issues can be culturally, feminine if you're female, or culturally masculine if you're male. We've talked about that earlier. And however, the gospel is not that God will just fix your issues, but that he sent Jesus to die for your sins and give you righteousness. And that's the justification part. And then we can go from there into our lifelong sanctification, living a life of being Christian and in a assurance of relationship and salvation through Christ. How can churches with similar convictions come around your practice to help these individuals out?
Yeah, I think we want to really collectively relate differently to people in this space. Assume that they are people who have maturity and the capacity for greater spiritual maturity. Assume that the person sitting across from you has done more work than you in this area. I would say for many of us, we've had the luxury of not having to ask these questions because it's not our own story.
Yeah.
And I think being honest about that, this is not my experience, and I don't want you to have to teach me everything about it, but I do want to learn with you, and I do want to walk with you. And I see in you the image of God. And anytime you can, pull out the signs of spiritual maturity and help a person grow those. So it's not just fixating on gender, not just fixating on what's not there for this person, but what is there? What are the giftings that they have to offer your communities? Because we can survive a lot of hard things if we have a place we belong and a sense of purpose and a sense of identity. And what I talk about a lot in my writing is, what's the identity we have to offer people? If it's broken, disordered, delusional, and that's the end of the conversation, we don't have a compelling gospel. But that's
No,
not the
not at all.
gospel, as you point out. The gospel is you are a beloved child of God. Full stop. And we step more and more in relationship with a God who wants to show us how he sees us. And we get to be the tangible hands and feet of God in how we sit with people. And that means sitting in really uncomfortable places where maybe you're sitting with a 14-year-old who says, you know what, this is not a struggle for me. It's been freeing for me to recognize that I have gender distress because now I have a word for it. And so I don't like the word struggle. I like to think of it as, this is a part of who I am that makes me unique. And how do you sit with somebody like that? How do you walk with somebody? How do you pull out their strengths and love on them with a love that is supernatural, something that we actually have to ask for. And Nick, to your point, in this space, we all want answers. People exploring gender, identifying as transgender, they want answers too. We all want answers. And we live in the not yet where the Holy Spirit doesn't always come in my life with all the answers, and perhaps I'll die with a lot of things not cleaned up. And isn't that part of being human, actually, and part of why we need God so desperately? So really living out those convictions in how we relate to one another, and making our churches prioritize being open, safe, secure for people identifying and exploring gender is a really good place to start. I think if we did that, a lot of other things would shake out quite nicely.
Yeah, and I think, it's just so comforting to know as Christians our identity is in Christ.
Yeah, it's
And
not in our identity, what we, because that can shift and change, and we could be worried about it. But that's not ultimately who we are. That can be freeing. Yeah,
and even talking to non-Christians, knowing that we're representing Christ too. Our identity is in Christ. Our old man is gone. It was nailed to the tree 2,000 years ago. We are in Christ. So if you're dealing with any sort of depression issues or anything else, it's comforting to know that you have an option to find your identity in God, actually.
Right, right. And he's not requesting us to tweak, fix, cure things in order to receive who we are. And there's a lot we don't understand about our experience of the world and why and how and where. But there is some level of freedom that can come from a genuine relationship with a God who sees us where we are.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Sadusky, so much for coming on our show, for talking about these complex issues. I know some people might like what we said, might not like what we said, and didn't just kind of come down hard with the hammer. But like you said, this is a tough conversation, that we have our convictions, but we also want to lovingly come around. And I think all too often, too poorly, we do this. And so maybe where can they find you? And maybe as a last kind of word, how can churches maybe come around a practice like yours, or find other people who can talk about these issues in a constructive way, not a destructive way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think as far as following my work, my website will probably be available in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy enough. It's my first and last name.com.
Mm-hmm.
People are always able to email me or go on the website and request. I do trainings for churches. I do consultations with families, parents in the state of Colorado. That's where I live. We're out of state. Sometimes people can meet with me virtually. So there's a couple of options there to track me down. The books are out there, so they're kind of easy to find, bright colors. So look for bright blue and bright orange. And that's available for people. And then I would say, how do you find other people? I'm trying to build out on my website resourcing. So just books, podcasts, organizations that are in this space. And doing it in a way that I think is really helpful and constructive. And so that's available to people. Preston Sprinkle's Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender has a ton of resourcing, good connections to people all across the country. And people can always email me. If you're looking for a therapist and I'm not available, I'm happy to try to find somebody with you and try to see who would be a good fit and help you navigate that system, because it's a hard one to try to figure out. And I think the hardest thing with therapists is finding a good fit. And once you do, it's great. And if you can't, it's really tough. So I can relate to that, and happy to help people try to track down good referral options as well.
Are you okay giving out your email?
Yeah, that's no problem. It's Dr. and then my last name, Sadusky, Sadusky at luxcc.org.
Cool. Yeah, we'll have that in the show notes too, to direct people if they like to email you. And this has been such a really great conversation. And I hope it's been helpful for those who either struggle with these issues, or people who know people who struggle with these issues. How do we better approach these? And again, so often the church is known as, it can be helpful at points and not helpful at other points. And I think here it's not helpful. It's convictions on front end, because if you're not super clear, then you're not being a gospel loving person. No, actually that's not generally how Jesus worked. Jesus brought you in, and then after getting to know you, then he brought his convictions to who you were and where you were at. But thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really, really helpful. And I hope other people realize the church can talk about these issues and can come around individuals who struggle with these things and say, you know what, all of us are struggling with something. You're struggling with your identity. We're struggling with our identity. This is something that we can all kind of get around with. So thank you so much, Dr. Sadusky, for coming on.
Absolutely. It's great to have this conversation. Thanks for bringing me on.
Of course.